All right, everyone. Welcome to the next session covering SBOMs in the automotive industry, real world insights and recommendations. With software supply chain security, with software supply chain security and emerging regulations gaining attention, SBOMs are becoming essential for lifecycle for automotive manufacturers and suppliers. This talk explores the SBOM lifecycle from generation and distribution to ingestion and aggregation to continuous monitoring and vulnerability management, offering practical guidance based on real world industry experience. Join us as Cortez Fraser Jr., Principal Product Manager at FOSA, leading SBOM and vulnerability management solutions for automotive and enterprise clients. Please welcome Cortez Fraser Jr. to the stage. Hi, Cortez.
Hey, mic check 1 2 1 2. Am I coming through? Okay.
Yeah, it sounds great.
Awesome.
What I'm going to do though is I'm going to hide the video from the stage. If you can go ahead and share your screen with your presentation, then we'll get you going.
Awesome. Let me share my screen 1 second here.
Maybe while you're getting your screen ready to go, just a reminder, if you do have questions, go ahead and shoot those questions into the Q&A tab. There is a chat going on as well, so you can always kind of chat. Cortez is probably not going to be monitoring that, but the hosts and other participants can see that as well. And please don't forget to check out the global news feed at the top right. You're going to see a little red circle that's going on there, and you'll get the latest giveaways, news, feedback, surveys, and all that good stuff that we have going on here at SOS. So without further ado, Cortez, the stage is yours, my man.
Alrighty. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. As you've already mentioned, my name is Cortez Fraser. I am a director of product at FOSS. I got a small promotion in between the time of the submission and where this is going on now, so that's really awesome. Yeah, I can't wait to talk to you all about just kind of SBOMs in the real world, in particular for automotive use cases and how they're impacted. Just real quickly, a little bit about FOSSA. FOSSA is a kind of a comprehensive SBOM lifecycle management platform, specifically for helping our customers manage supply chain risks, SBOM generation, SBOM ingestion, and things of that nature. Now, let's get into the fun parts, the meat and potatoes of the conversation. At a high level, just from an agenda standpoint, I want to talk to you a little bit about the SBOM landscape for those who may or may not be as familiar, how we kind of got here, what are some of those drivers. Then from there, I'm going to walk through 3 scenarios, and you'll notice that these scenarios are going to build on top of each other as they are additive, meaning that in order for you to reach this kind of 3rd level of maturity, and my bullet number 4 there, then you got to work your way through 2 and 3 in order to expand that. And then if we have any time at the end for any questions that have come in through Q&A, then I can address those there as well. Before I kind of jump into the actual topics, though, let me take a small step back and tell you a bit about me. Why should you listen to me? Why do I have an opinion on some of these things? I'd say, obviously, I've gotten a ton of experience working with SBOMs, working here at Boston, and particularly leading the product function. And so I've worked with a lot of customers. And so every single one of these scenarios are real scenarios that our customers are using SBOM, either generation, curation, or ingestion for today, and are actually walking through every single one of these processes end to end. Now, on top of that, prior to working at FOSS, I worked at Puppet, where I was doing product for a cloud security posture management product there. But before then, I was working at GE Power as a cybersecurity architect. And so much more in the practitioner's shoes, like many of you all today. At that time, we had about 1,800 developers under my purview, 600 600 applications, only 3 of us on the team. And so lots of scale and leverage needed in order to get that level of coverage, knowing that we as individuals could not meet that. And at that time, SBOMs, while they existed not in the same formats that I'll talk about today, they would have been incredibly beneficial to some of those activities. And so that is also a large driver of where I believe these scenarios bring a lot of value as to help for those situations that I constantly found myself in as a security practitioner. All right, let's jump in and start talking in a bit more details here. So taking a quick look at the kind of SBOM landscape, how did we get here? What is the background context for this? If we, rewind the clock back to, I think it was December of 2021, maybe if I remember correctly, we had a, massive SolarWinds attack. They were compromised, and it kind of put the world on notice that we are relying within our software supply chain on a lot of software that we have no insight into. We have no idea what's kind of going on, and that has then led into compromises. That then, obviously matriculated into the infamous Log4j attack. And at that point in time, at least we at GE were scrambling, doing complicated regex queries across our GitHub repositories, looking at pom.xml files and other manifest files to try to see if we're using any of these vulnerable packages. Now, in hindsight, especially as someone who knows far more about dependency management, dependency resolution, and dependency conflicts, that was a terrible way for us to go about trying to find where that risk is. And that is a time frame by which if we would have had accurate SBOMs across all of our applications, it would have been significantly easier for us. And so from a regulation standpoint, the Executive Order 14028 came out in response to a lot of these, kind of fire drill activities that most of us were doing in the security space at that time. And that has then matriculated into a whole bunch of individual requirements, right? You have things like, I'd say regulation adjacent in the form of CISA, putting out things like the minimum elements, and they've actually just now recently revamped their minimum elements, which I think is incredibly interesting. Of course, out in the European Union, you have things like the CRA, which is, I know the automotives have a special carve out there, so no immediate impacts, but you may have some adjacencies there. And then things like UNR 155, which absolutely has impacts on the automotive manufacturers and their suppliers. So these are some of the drivers for why, regardless of whether you're currently impacted by one of these regulations or not, you really want to start thinking in your organization around how can you actively either produce SBOMs or should you actually be requiring them from your suppliers? And we'll talk about some of those scenarios here in a bit more detail. Awesome. For those who have never seen an SBOM before or are not familiar with the particular formats, at the end of the day, all a bill of materials is a list of components. Now, they've gone and put together two. There's more than these two, but the other ones I think are not as impactful, but two very popular standards in order to kind of make this more of a machine readable approach, such that all tooling, regardless of whether that's open source or commercial, can then be able to analyze that and start to make some intelligent decisions. And so SPDX and CycloneDX are those two standards. Both of them are fantastic standards that have their own uses and their own kind of leverages. I think SPDX, generally speaking, has a little bit higher quality licensing support. CycloneDX, generally speaking, has a little bit high quality vulnerability report. I think each individual creator would tell me that I'm wrong, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. Both specifications are really good, and you got to use the one that fits within your requirements most easily. Personally, I'm a big fan of CycloneDX. I think they do a great job with backwards compatibility, but I think both standards are perfectly fine to use as long as you are including the proper metadata to then be able to associate, things like unique identifiers in the package URL with those. Taking this a bit step further, this is actual excerpts from real software bill of materials. In this particular case, we're looking at this package code mirror 6.0.1. We're going to do things like the name, the version, but the thing that I really want you to spend a lot of time paying attention to is on the right hand side here we have this BOM reference and this Perl. You'll notice that they're the same because BOM reference can be any unique identifier. Makes sense to use the Perl there to kind of keep it simple. But this is the thing that allows for you to start to associate both licenses and vulnerabilities and not purely rely on the SBOM as truth. And I can talk to you a bit more around why that's important. Outside of that, though, all this additional metadata is really awesome. Things like your copyright, your licensing text. The most recent CISA regulation actually now requires license information. It's no longer a optional or suggested field. It is firmly a part of the minimum elements. And a license risk is actually an interesting one because it can become a security problem over time, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Righty, let me take a breather. So as we start to think about ways that we can like leverage SBOMs to start to get real world value from them, I think one of the most immediate things that I find valuable in this regard is a combination of VEX, vulnerability exploitability exchange, and then VDR, the vulnerability disclosure report. And so if you yet to have any experiences with these particular formats, I want to break them down a bit more. Oftentimes, most people hear about VEX, right? Your ability to communicate to anyone consuming that SBOM that you're not affected or impacted by a particular vulnerability in the context by which that you're using that. And that is incredibly valuable. I think that is definitely one of the primary points of value for at least distributing SBOMs. But the VDR, the vulnerability disclosure report, is actually what most people are referring to when they think about all the associated metadata for this. And so at the end of the day, as I'm sure you've experienced, the vast majority of vulnerabilities are not exploitable in the context by which that you're using them, right? And so you have to be able to proactively communicate that information, else you'll be in a situation where someone ingests an SBOM into, a tool like FOSSA or dependency track or any of the other open source versions, and they're going to surface a lot of risk that they may actually not be affected to. And so with the VEX statement, you want to assert both one, a status, is this affected, not affected, under investigation, or fixed, and then a justification, in particular if you're asserting that this is not affected. And so why are you asserting that? Because inline mitigation already exists, for example. How that then culminates in practice is, and I think I skipped ahead too far. There we go. How that culminates in practice is then being able to give all the metadata, so CVE information, CVSS score, severity information, what versions are vulnerable to this particular CVE. All that information comprises the VDR, the vulnerability disclosure report. And then after you've communicated all that background context, this small analysis array here is oftentimes the only portion that is compromises the VEX. And so at this point in time, communicating that state, in this particular case, not affected, justification because inline mitigation already exists, and then with that detail, you can then provide an immediate excerpt of why that is safe to use, and then oftentimes our customers will then link to some type of external customer security advisory that then has all the details of the amount of research and evidence that kind of went into that. So VEX, very, very powerful. Keep this thought in the back of your mind as you work our way through these scenarios. All right. Now that we've done a really good job of kind of just doing a bit of stage setting on why or some of the concepts that I think you need to understand in order to work your way through these scenarios, let's kind of talk through them. As I, started with, this first stage of maturity, if you will, is probably where most of you are all at today, which is purely either a customer of mine or one of my customers is demanding SBOMs from me, and I have to find a way to provide them to them. And so that is where we're going to start. And that then allows for us to get additional leverage. We've already mentioned a lot of the regulation that requires this, but oftentimes there's an indirect association that a lot of times people miss. And so you may not directly be required to provide SBOMs as part of this regulation, but your customers then have a government contract that then needs you to provide that, so that way they can then provide that. So you'll see how that kind of matriculates and how we want to combine those particular SBOMs together. And this also allows for you to, start to get a sense of those supply chain risks in your critical infrastructure. Now, you are going to run into some challenges along the way in order to kind of meet this. I think the biggest challenge is, how do you make sure that your SBOM is complete, right? There's, at the end of the day, kind of crap in equals crap out as it pertains to SBOM generation and consumption. And so you have to make sure that whatever tooling it is that you're using, there's all kinds of glorious open source tooling out there, or if you're using a commercial offering, that's fine as well. But make sure that it has full language coverage, and that you're scanning in the proper places, right? And so oftentimes you may scan an SBOM at source. The dependencies that you have at source can actually look very different than the dependencies that you deploy in production, as looks very different than the ones that you're using during build or compile time. And so making sure that you are consistently generating those SBOMs in the same place. My recommendation would be after build time, right before deployment. I think that's where you're going to get the most accurate list of dependencies that are at least being deployed into production. And then making sure that you have coverage for non-package managed ecosystems. Very transparently within the automotive space, that's going to be your biggest challenge. Oftentimes we're working with embedded device manufacturers. Generating an SBOM for things that are managed with like Maven or npm or Python is generally very, very easy to do, because for the most part those package managers have native tooling to do that. The unmanaged ecosystems is a bit more tricky. We'll spend a little bit more time talking about strategies there, but that is going to be the biggest kind of concern or thing that you want to be able to worry about. I think the other thing that you'll want to be really mindful of too as you're generating and distributing these SBOMs is this distinction between static components of an SBOM and dynamic components of an SBOM. So static components meaning things that aren't going to change ever unless you've actually made a change to that code base. And so, your package name and version, right? Those are going to be consistent. The license information, that's going to be static. However, there is a subset of information that's oftentimes dynamic. The vulnerabilities being a big one. And so communicating that with a VEX and VDR statement, in particular, if you can do one that's not embedded within the SBOM itself and actually be distributed alongside the software that you're consuming, and then support status as well, right? And so is this being actively maintained or has this been abandoned? And these are the type of dynamic information that you want to be able to communicate to anyone consuming this particular SBOM. Alrighty. So let's kind of walk through a little bit of an end-to-end workflow on how and what stages that you would like to incorporate the various aspects. And so starting on my top left-hand side here, you have your source code, your developer is working on something, they make an awesome change, great, and they want to submit a pull request for that, right? At that point in time, that's when you'd want to initiate some type of scan on that pull request using your tooling of choice, whether that be static analysis, obviously BCA scan would be less impactful there, but at least you have that option. And then most importantly, that will then lead you into a license and vulnerability review. I did want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the licensing aspect of this. As I mentioned previously, that is now a required component from CISA. And the reason why I think it's important is because if you have restrictive licenses that you're unaware of, and so they have copyleft requirements, meaning that you have to disclose your source code if you're modifying, the particular open source package, or if you're using it in a way distributing it on-prem, for example, then that immediately becomes a security concern for you, because if you're then forced to open source your code, this proprietary closed source code, or at least what was deemed to be proprietary as a result of that, you've now given threat actors obviously a very direct blueprint. And this is even more impactful in the automotive space, where you may have already distributed most of the software to in-vehicle or devices by which that changing that particular code base is incredibly challenging unless you have like a really strong OTA process. So doing that license review ahead of time prior to actually distributing that software is going to be very, very critical for you, and ensuring that your SBOM is accurate based on that is going to be critical. Okay, I'll get off my licensing high horse now for a second. I'm kind of working our way back through the rest of this workflow. From a vulnerability review standpoint, you're looking to be able to make a determination of, am I exploitable to this particular CVE that's been detected, and do I need to create any VEX or VDR statements in order to assert that we are not exploitable to that? After you've worked your way through all those particular vulnerabilities, and so you've decided that you're in a good place, and you can safely merge that SBOM, and then go ahead and build that application. So I apologize. You can merge that code base and then build that application, which will then enable you to generate that SBOM right afterwards. So that is kind of the happy path, if you will. As you can see, there's a couple of opportunities where you're going to have to go back to restart it go. If you've done your license review, you determine that you're vulnerable to that particular code base. Obviously, we want to fix that. We'll kind of keep down that loop until you've gotten to a free point. From there, it's super, super important to make sure that you're actually doing this in the scope of the delivery of that application. So you may be developing in the scope of individual repositories, and then after you've worked your way through either these various microservices or repositories, you want to be able to combine them together into what we'll oftentimes reference as an application level SBOM. That application level SBOM is very important, in particular because with transitive dependencies, you oftentimes are not including the same transitive dependencies in isolation of that repo as you will if you look at the entire application as a whole. And so making sure that your SBOM can represent that final state is very important. And then assuming you've made it through all of these checks up to this point, you can then go ahead and deploy to production safely, at which point in time you would then want to feed your SBOM into your distribution method of choice. That distribution method could be an internal intranet that you maintain yourself. That could be something that you are distributing with alongside your software in and of itself, where you actually embedded it with like an SDK or something of that nature. Or you may have some type of SBOM portal or platform where people can consistently go back to look for updates. A couple of best practices and things that you want to be mindful of for this kind of first scenario. That accurate SBOM generation is going to be key, in particular, making sure you're consistently generating your SBOM at the same point in time across all of your repositories. So after that build phase, right before production, ideally. And then also, how are you distributing these SBOMs and doing that in a safe way? I won't spend too much time on it yet because it's a hot topic in further aspects of my talk here. But one of the big concerns that people often have is, if I'm distributing this SBOM, is it going to be safely handled? This is a lot of my own personal IP or potentially security risks associated there. And so having things like time-based access controls fully validated via RBAC to ensure that SBOM is only going to your intended target is going to be pretty key. And then lastly, having some type of event-driven means by which that you're dynamically updating those dynamic parts that I mentioned earlier, such as the vulnerabilities, end-of-life announcement, any additional security advisories, and things of that nature as well. So here's an example coming from the CNCF, where they host a few SBOMs here. You can check out this link if you'd like to view them and get a sense of, hey, what does Kubernetes SBOM look like, for example. So. Alrighty, let me take me a quick sip of water here. Now that we made it through that kind of first level of maturity, I think we start to get into the much more interesting parts, which is great. Now that I can generate SBOMs on an ongoing basis, how do I start to have some interesting either conversations, metadata, or insight driven from this additional categorization that I'm doing? And so one of those is a more internal use case. And so oftentimes, if you're in a really large organization, you actually don't have either direct source code access or direct CI pipeline access to all of the projects across your organization. Or you oftentimes have a bunch of different scanners, right? And so you may have some teams using, their own homegrown solutions. You may have some other teams using commercial solutions. You may have some teams that scan at source, but then they also scan in runtime with a whiz or something of that nature, right? So how do you start to aggregate all these various SBOMs across your organization into a central pane of glass that you can actually start to get some insight? So you can actually start to dedupe vulnerabilities that are appearing in multiple places. And so that's where this SBOM aggregation workflow becomes incredibly powerful. And this is super important because, we're obviously seeing it, right? Obviously, in the automotive space, you're probably not using as much, NPM and JavaScript, but for those situations where you are, I think we've just seen almost 45 or 50 or so different malware packages that have come out over the course of the past week or so that have been heavily compromised. And I suspect that these type of attacks are going to continue to happen. And oftentimes they don't have CVEs associating with them. And so your existing tooling may or may not alert on those if they don't have any CVEs. That then becomes a little bit of a manual process on your end, and then be able to look across your organization to associate them. But I think that's incredibly powerful because you are then able to determine what's a true risk for your organization and then be able to surface that. So something else that I think is important to consider here is this concept of SSVC. I won't spend too much time on it, but it stands for the Stakeholder Specific Vulnerability Categorization. So this is a really awesome framework that CISA kind of came up with. Very transparently, I think it's overly verbose. I think it could definitely be a bit convoluted, but at the high level, it attempts to help you quantify based on the particular risk signals. And so that could be things like, is this externally facing or internally facing? That could be things like, does this have access to crown jewel information for us or not, right? And so a lot of these different metadata points that you want to consider to then ultimately make a decision. Do I need to stop everything that I'm doing to then immediately remediate this vulnerability? Or is this something that I can kind of put on my standard quarterly backlog and address over time? And so while I do heavily believe that SSBC is overly complex, I think what I've seen a lot of organizations be very successful with is in curating that and tailoring it towards their own internal environment. So in that way, they can actually, fast track that decision matrix and be a bit more custom. And then lastly, I think there's a lot of leverage that you're going to get from this particular workflow around similar architectures. And so something that we see very, very commonly is that we'll have, customers who are using all the same types of, Content projects or Spring Boot projects or build root projects and things of that nature. And so because the development teams have similar tech stacks across the board and thus are using similar packages, then you can actually start to make some more strategic refactor decisions where you can say, great, well, looking across my entire install base, I can actually probably remove the largest amount of CVEs for the least amount of refactor effort if I prioritize this, Spring Boot update, right, or something of that nature, and then be able to plan that across multiple development teams so they can then get synergies and how that's being consumed, or having downstream SDKs that are then being consumed in the upstream, from those particular applications will then allow for you to solve these vulnerabilities in the underlying SDK and then have that matriculate down to the additional projects. And all of that type of decision making is only possible if you start to work your way into this SBOM aggregation kind of workflow. Now you are going to run into some serious challenges along the way, or very transparently. The biggest challenge is how do you correctly, uniquely identify components and be able to talk across different SBOM generation methods. I think the best way for you to do that is using a package URL. I think package URLs are significantly better than CPE in almost every possible way. Don't at me, I'm sorry. But no, I mean, my jokes aside, I think CPE definitely has its place. One of the biggest limitations of Perl is it does not have a type for commercial packages, and there's no real means by which for you to be able to express that. And so I think that's an interesting challenge that we'll have to kind of work around. But most importantly, it's just being able to say, if I have zlib 1.3 for a particular ecosystem, how do I communicate to whatever is consuming my SBOM that they have that exact same version, in particular on the vulnerability side, where zlib 1.3 across multiple ecosystems can actually be maintained by different maintainers, thus can have its own set of vulnerabilities. And so package name and version alone are wildly insufficient for you to be able to relate any packages that you're using from a vulnerability standpoint. And so that's something that I want you to really hone in on as you take this back to your internal organizations. Another big challenge that you're going to run into is just inconsistencies in between SBOM formats. It's not just converting from lifecycle index to SPDX, but they have different concepts in and of themselves. These are going to be lesser problems, but just something to be mindful around. Things like, hey, what does a manufacturer mean as compared to a supplier, as compared to an originator, for example? And then, really, really poor internal governance, right? If you have some organizations that are generating SBOMs at source, you have other organizations that are generating or other parts of your organization that are generating SBOMs at runtime. Those SBOMs are oftentimes going to be incomplete. At runtime, you don't have the relationship information to be able to associate direct and transit dependencies, and thus you're going to say all of your dependencies are direct dependencies there, even though they're not. And so you're going to have a lot of incongruencies between that. So just having that consistency around when and where you're generating your SBOMs and what scopes are you including, right? Are you including dev and test dependencies for all of your SBOMs generation, or are you only going to include production dependencies for that? And there's, various dependents. I have a really strong one, which you should do. I very much believe that you should include all dependencies in that SBOM, and then you should tag them and flag them as whether they're production or dev or test, so that way that information can be properly matriculated. So, all right, now that we've done some wonderful stage setting, let's actually jump into what this process will look like in practice for you. So we're going to be picking up right where we left off. We've generated that application level SBOM. We're in a really good place. We're now going to distribute that to our command center, right? So that's going to be your centralized organization that wants to consume this to start to make some interesting decisions. That's when you import this SBOM, you actually really don't want to rely on the SBOM metadata outside of that unique identifier. So once you have a high quality unique identifier, let's say Perl in this case, Omnivore ID is also a really good option. Then you would then start to surface vulnerability risk and license risk now based off of that unique identifier. What you don't want to do is only read the BDR statement, the disclosure report in that SBOM, and then associate vulnerabilities that way. The primary reason being is net new vulnerabilities are coming out every day. And so if you're only relying on the SBOM itself to communicate those, you're constantly going to be behind the ball where you want to be able to proactively research and investigate that information. And then that's when you start to work your way through this decision tree. Now that you have that and you're able to get some leverage, for this particular application, what's its criticality? Is it externally facing? What's the risk profile of that application? Moving beyond that is for this particular CVE, is this vulnerable? And I apologize. Sorry, I'm seeing a little bit of feedback around the size of it. Let me see if I can zoom in just a little bit. second. I don't think in my slideshow view I'm going to be able to, but I will absolutely send these slides out right afterwards. I apologize. But yeah, so is this particular vulnerability exploitable in the context by which that I'm using it? If that answer is no, then I'm able to put that further down in my kind of quarterly planning cycle. If it is exploitable, obviously I'm starting to have to make some more decisions at this point. One of those big ones is there an immediate safe version that then fixes this, or is this going to require like a fairly significant refactor effort for me, right? Or is there even a safe version at all? Oftentimes there isn't a safe version. If there is a safe version, does this safe version, by safe I mean safe for this particular CVE, does this actually improve my security posture, or does this put me in a worse security posture? We see this very, very commonly within our customer base, which is in the attempt to resolve one CVE, you've actually then upgraded to a version of a package that is more vulnerable than where you were previously and actually reduced your overall security posture. And then lastly, can I get some additional leverage here, right? If I make this version bump, if I do this refactor work, do I actually get other CVEs along the way that I'm able to remediate? And what kind of views do I have to then be able to communicate that? Lastly, if there's no breaking changes, great. Then you're able to go ahead and ship that. And then you can obviously make the decision to remediate immediately if these are yeses. And then, of course, you can put that into your sprinting or quarterly planning if they're no's. So this is I'd say, heavily modified version of the SSBC framework. And this is just an attempt at how this looks. I'd say all of the automotive manufacturer customers that we have do this exact process that I'm referring to right here. And so this is definitely like real world examples of about 3 or 4 customers. The last thing I just wanted to share real quick on this particular topic is, how do you start to get leverage around these vulnerability remediations that you're making? In this particular case, I wanted to kind of show how oftentimes there's many, many vulnerabilities that you're able to remediate along the way. In this particular case, I'm just showing an example of how we, group and categorize, high priority risks for you. And then also try to use a bit of intelligence to make a decision on, well, very transparently with, Bootstrap, you can go from 3.0.3 to, probably 4.0 in order to remove a subset of these vulnerabilities. But going to 5.0 is the one that's no longer introducing worse vulnerabilities for you. And so that's what allows for you to want to go a bit further along that jump. And then lastly, I just want to continue to emphasize that finding a way to centralize around your unique identifiers is going to be a challenge. And this is incredibly challenging in the automotive space. I want to be very transparent there. And the reason why it's challenging is because oftentimes you're rolling your own Linux distribution, for example. And so you have to decide which distribution do you want to associate your vulnerabilities to. And I think it's very important that you do that, because if you associate that to, Wolfie's distribution where that's already been patched and maintained, or Red Hat's distribution where it's already patched and maintained, but yours is not patched, you're actually giving yourself a false sense of security. And so you want to be incredibly mindful of how you're choosing to surface these particular vulnerability risks. All right. I'm going to do our last scenario real quickly before I get on out of here. Now that we've kind of reached this last level of maturity, you're generating SBOMs on a regular basis per build, which is fantastic. You're aggregating them together into an application level SBOM so you can look across your entire organization and start to get some leverage. Lastly, the only piece missing is any of your external suppliers. So anyone who's not inside of your internal organization, we now need to command SBOM from, and most importantly, enforce your SBOM policies and requirements onto them. A lot of this is going to come from a lot of the regulatory requirements that we kind of mentioned earlier in order for you to communicate as a software manufacturer or hardware manufacturer, the types of software supporting risks that you've consumed along that way, right? And so that's where a lot of this motivation comes from. This also allows for you to communicate non-CVE based risks, right? So typo squatting, dependency confusion, malicious packages, malicious contributors, things of that nature. You're definitely going to run into some serious technical challenges here. I've already alluded to these along the way, but in particular with embedded devices, I think having that distinction between Yocto, Buildroot in particular, where you're rolling your own Linux distribution or you're vendoring in your entire source code into those particular build systems, and you've either modified that heavily or you've changed it significantly, it becomes a great challenge for I think like Conan, for example. If you generate a Conan Perl, that's great. but Conan doesn't have its own vulnerabilities. And so generator Conan Pearl isn't valuable to you from the lens of vulnerability association unless you're asserting a particular ecosystem to be able to map that to. This is the reason why you'll see a lot of SBOM generators kind of default to generic pearls where the type is generic. And I understand the plight because that is often a valid determination. But that valid determination is not, that valid determination is not going to allow for you to actually accurately map vulnerabilities. So that's the reason why that generic Perl is, in my opinion, not any more useful than just providing a name and version at that point in time. So the other things is just making sure that you have consistency across those dependency scopes, right? Are these, am I consistently communicating whether something's statically linked versus dynamically linked? Massive impacts there from both a vulnerability and a licensing standpoint. And then I do want to proactively get ahead of, hey, if I share my SBOMs, am I, giving threat actors a blueprint for how to attack me? Or am I exposing my IP? I mean, I do want to spend just a little bit of time on this one because it is a challenge that we run into constantly. I want to be very transparent. It is a non-zero risk that you could be giving some type of additional insight. By providing that SBOM right to a threat actor. The reason why I use the term non-zero is because it's hard to quantify, given that most threat actors are not taking hyper-targeted attacks like that, right? They're normally taking a much broader approach to trying to compromise a particular system, but it is once again a non-zero chance. But I just want to remind that this is a list of packages and package versions that you have, and so ultimately, if your security posture is so poor, very transparently, that just knowing the existence of a particular package name and version is enough to compromise your system. That is massive failures kind of along that security chain, in my opinion. And I feel very, very strongly the same way on the IP side, which is ultimately if someone can reverse engineer your particular software based off just the existence of a particular package, that is not IP from my lens. It's not the existence of that package. It is your usage of it. It is the data that you're generating. It is the uniqueness by which that you're able to create value for your customers with those packages, not the fact that they exist. So just something to be mindful of. All right. Just to kind of close out this scenario very quickly, this one is actually like super simple and straightforward. You're going to get the application level SBOM from your suppliers, in particular if you're an OEM. You're then going to ingest that SBOM, use that unique identifier as I've associated to or alluded to earlier, to then make a determination of does this meet my third-party SBOM policy. And this part's super important because there's both analysis of the SBOM metadata in and of itself, which is associating licenses and bones, but there's purely, does this SBOM even have enough information to be useful to me, right? And so we have a lot of customers that have created these SBOM policies. They then make physical policies for their suppliers to then consume, but then that puts you in the scenario where you're essentially doing constant back and forth, via email or something of that nature, where your supplier provides you an SBOM, doesn't meet your policy, you tell them that, they fix it, they provide you again, still doesn't fully meet your policy, right? And you can see how that back and forth is then leads to a position. By the time you get an accurate SBOM, you may not even be using that particular software version anymore. And so once you've gotten to that point where you do have an accurate SBOM that meets all the metadata, right, has accurate unique identifiers, has name, and has version, has license information, all the things that you'd be looking for from a structural standpoint, then you can then start to do that analysis on the metadata. So look up those vulns, look up the licensing policy, check that SBOM if there are vulns to see if there's a VEX statement that then asserts a lack of exploitability to that. If not, then you need to reach out to that supplier and harass them a bit on, do you have a VEX statement for this, or what's your answer to this exploitability? If they do have a VEX statement, then great, you can continue to work your way through the rest of those vulnerabilities until you reach the point where you have no new vulns to work through. Lastly, you can then combine all this glorious information together into a first and third party SBOM, pin that to a particular commit and revision. So that way, then if you're maintaining multiple of these in production, you can monitor them continuously over time. So the This workflow is honestly the one I'm most excited about because I feel very, very strongly that if we can all reach this third level of maturity where every single one of our suppliers, whether they're hardware or software suppliers, are required to provide us these bills of materials that we then ingest on a consistent basis while having a dynamic conversation between us, the entire industry would be in a far more secure place if we can reach that level of maturity. And here's just a simple example on what it looks like to analyze some of that metadata surrounding that SBOM, and then what what it will look like to see more of a cleaner kind of fixed SBOM in this particular case. So a lot of the tooling out there, once again, both commercial or open source tooling, would do a lot of enrichment to be able to help kind of close the gap to a certain extent on poorly provided SBOMs, such that you can start to reduce that back and forth that you're having with your suppliers. But with that, just a couple of last little key takeaways that I want you to be mindful of. Of course, if you're sending these SBOMs in a dynamic way, make sure that you're doing that as securely as possible. So those time-based access tokens, as well as using proper encryption standards, are going to be huge. I think also being very transparent about your SBOM evaluation criteria, right? And so what metadata do you need to be absolutely in existence for you to then have a high quality experience consuming that? And so minimum elements is a great place to start. Ensure you include unique IDs, but be very prescriptive about, hey, yes, you must include a Perl, but a generic Perl is not going to be sufficient. Or if you provided a generic Perl, you have to point me towards a Linux ecosystem to be able to associate that with, right, or any other ecosystem. With that, I want to be mindful of the time that I have here. I've had such a great session with you all, kind of just talking through this. This is definitely a topic that I'm super passionate about and can't wait to see the industry adopt and mature on more. With that, I'll open it up to any questions that may be coming through. All right, looking in chat here, I see a couple. Let me work my way through these.
Okay, Curtis, perfect. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very good and comprehensive. So now it's a time for question and answers. I'll try to bring the questions on the stage so we can go one by one. I'll just bring the question on stage. It will be on the display. You can read it here. I can also read it loud. If the generated SBOM complies with a valid schema like SPDX or Cyclone DX, does it really matter which tool is used to create it? Can I simply create my own script or tool to populate the required fields in JSON file?
Yes, absolutely you can. And I actually totally agree with this because oftentimes you're not going to be able to generate a SPDX or Cyclone DX SBOM out of the box, depending on the particular software that you're using. So yes, you 100% can create your own tool or script to kind of just populate the required fields in the SBOM. I would just very much caution you that following the specification is one side of it, but ensuring that what you include in that field for the specification is another one. And so the example I'll constantly point to is generic Perls. You can include a unique identifier to check the box that you have, but if you use a generic Perl that's non-descriptive, then you haven't actually provided any row value in that particular case. But yes, 100%, it does not matter what tool that you use. You can do it by hand if you like and if you have the time. So
okay, perfect. Thank you for this. Now I'll bring the next question. There is also one more question you mentioned about, I will bring it down. Yeah, you mentioned about regulation, which applies the need of SBOMs, like which ask you to have SBOMs. Are there any expected maturity levels required for these SBOMs?
Yeah, that's a really good. Yeah, that's a good question around like the maturity levels. I don't think that there's requirements around the maturity levels for the SBOM itself, normally more requirements around the metadata associated with the SBOM. But what I will say though, and what I'm seeing very, very commonly is for the most part, at least our customer base is at the point where they refuse to buy software from any company, software or hardware from any company that can't produce an accurate bill of materials and can't do so in a dynamic way. And so I actually think that's more so where the maturity comes from, which is you will start to lose business if you can't do this on an ongoing basis.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
There is also another question, which is also on the screen now. How can an organization effectively leverage VDRs and VEX, what you also talked about, data to prioritize the remediation efforts without being overwhelmed by too many or volume of reported vulnerabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really good question, especially because of the scenario that I think a lot of customers are finding themselves in. I think ultimately the best way for you to take this is to import the SBOM initially, then subsequently consume that VEX or VDR statement. And then depending on, whether you're using a commercial tool or you're rolling your own thing, whatever you have there, you need to have some type of codified rules by which that you can essentially say, great, I have these 14 vulnerabilities. I've read a VEX statement that says I'm not affected to 13 out of the 14. So I can automatically ignore those particular vulnerabilities based on that. And I will also insert the detail and justification information from that VEX statement into the ignore decision that I've made. So then that way that's codified on a consistent basis. I think as long as you have a process that can do that, then from there, you actually immediately start to get the value of using VEX and VDR, because in that particular scenario, now it's only the one vulnerability that you have to review or go back and forth with your suppliers on. So I think it's a great question. I think the more automation that you can apply around consuming VEX and VDR, having that then translate into ignore rules for you, the more accurate that you'll be. So.
Okay, perfect. So maybe I have one last question from my side. Is there any, let's put it under this one. Is there any process framework or any standardization to manage this SBOM lifecycle? What you mentioned is like in customized way, what you mentioned, or is there any best practice or guideline or standard available to follow this different steps of life cycle of the SBOM itself?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And to my knowledge, there actually isn't one. I think that, so all the governments, so CISA, BIS, India with CERT-In, all of them have put together, I think, some really good documents around how you can think about SBOM lifecycle management. And so those are probably the ones I would start with, in particular, the CERT-In requirement coming out of India. I think that one is actually the most robust. And so that's the one I would point to if I were to choose one. But I actually don't think there's a great standard out for this. And you've kind of sparked my interest to maybe put my own to codify some of the things that I put in this speech and turn it into a formal standard that I can share with others. So.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think with this, we finished all the questions. We are on time. Thank you very much, Curtis, for a very interesting talk and very interesting discussion. And with this, we will end the session. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day ahead.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.